I'm going to use these for now. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the Mahatma Education Society and the Pillay family personally for their work, their responsiveness in establishing this. I agree with Pritika. I could not imagine this happening at any other institution. This is the place that's capable of doing this. I would also like to thank Pritika and the IDFC for their excellent help in coordinating and facilitating the establishment of this, and my colleague Manuel Madrid for traveling all the way from Valencia, Spain, to be here in India, working long days with no opportunities for tourism so far, in training and establishing this Urban Expansion Observatory. It has truly been a pleasure to be here. So I think I've already been introduced maybe 3 or 4 times, but I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Patrick Lamson Hall. I'm a researcher at New York University's Urbanization Project. Manuel Madrid and I are here today to give a talk, and if we're lucky it will be a brief talk about the work we do at the project and about cities and urban affairs in general. And for those of you who attended the talk that I gave, I think, a few weeks ago, the talk that I'm about to give right now is almost exactly the same. So this is actually not a bad thing. This is an opportunity for you to deepen your questions. To give a little background on myself personally, I'm not from an urban area. I live in New York now, but I grew up in Oregon, which, if you don't know, is located on the western coast of the United States. It's a state that has 2 main exports, grass seed and Christmas trees. So if you can imagine, this is a fairly rural place. I came to cities for the reason most people come to cities, which was to improve my life, to broaden my knowledge, increase my skills. This is an important thing to remember. When people move to cities, it's a decision that they're making because they believe that it will make their lives better. And they're often correct, which we'll get into later in the presentation. Sorry, I'm not completely familiar with this clicker, so I may go back and forth. So this is a brief organizational diagram of the urbanization project where I work. It's a project that was founded by an economist named Paul Romer in collaboration with my boss, Dr. Solly Angel, and an urban planner named Alain Berteau. The project has 3 legs, and it has the Charter Cities program, the country initiatives in monitoring global urban expansion, and I'll be discussing 2 of these. So the country initiatives are the work on the ground to help cities prepare for their coming expansion, like the project that Pritika mentioned we're doing here in India. The Monitoring Global Expansion project is a research project that this is dedicated to, that the Urban Expansion Observatory is a critical part of. And then finally we have Charter Cities, which is the creation of entirely new cities. So I'm involved in the country initiatives and in monitoring global urban expansion. So I won't be speaking about Charter Cities, but what I would like to do to start is show a brief video from Solly Angel and from Paul Romer to introduce these concepts and tell a bit more about the work. And if we're lucky, it will work.
What we're doing here at the NYU Stern Urbanization Project is harnessing the growth of cities to speed up global progress.
I coined the term the Urbanization Project to suggest that this is a project that humanity is now engaged in. Before 1800, cities never made up more than 10% of the population. In 1800, this started to accelerate, so that now half the people live in cities, and by 2100, maybe 75% to 80% will live in cities, and the project will be over. This is why it's a window of opportunity for us.
If the developing world is going to grow from urban population of 2.5 billion to something like 7.5 billion in the next 100 years, there's only 2 ways that can happen. The average city size in the developing world will have to triple, or it means we'll have to develop some entirely new cities. Those two strategies form the two major initiatives of the NYU Stern Urbanization Project. We want to encourage cities that will expand inevitably to plan for that expansion and take advantage of that process rather than be overwhelmed by it. At the same time, we want to encourage governments, societies, the world to think about the advantages that could come from starting some entirely new cities.
The decision to migrate from a village to a city is a conscious decision on someone's part to improve his or her life. Urbanization goes hand in hand with economic development. It goes hand in hand with better public health, with better education, with better opportunities for a higher quality of life.
Urbanization is this opportunity for whole societies to remake themselves. And if we shape urbanization, we can speed up progress and direct it in ways that could lead to substantially bigger improvements in the quality of life for billions of people.
So, as I'm sure you can all tell, this video was made for us by a public relations company. But I do think that it's good to hear, is this lapel mic, is this working? All right. I think it's a good thing to hear these ideas from the people who coined them. And if you find these ideas interesting in a more general way, the book to get it's by Dr. Angel, and it's called Planet of Cities. And this is a really excellent book that lays out urban expansion in the next 80, 90, 100 years. So let's kind of talk about what it means to make room for this urban expansion. Right. So one thing that we know about cities right now is that they're growing very rapidly. So we estimate that about 1/3 of the cities on Earth, which is 1,300 cities, are growing at 3% or more per year. And because of the magic of exponential growth, what this means is that those cities will at least double in population in the next 20 years, which makes sense actually because right now the world is about 50% urbanized, which is to say about half of all human beings live in cities. And it's expected to be 70% urbanized by 2050, meaning at least 2 billion people will have to move to cities in that time, in roughly the next 30 years. So making room for urban expansion means preparing land for this coming growth. In the image here, what you're seeing is the future arterial roads plan for a city that I've worked with in Ethiopia. This is Mekelle and Tigray. And this is a map of the roads that will be needed to service the areas where growth is coming in the next 30 years. The old city is located here. This is how much the city will be growing based on their own population projections. So the work that we do is underscored by 4 principles, which I'll lay out in the following slides. And these are the principles. I try not to read text on slides. I assume that most of us here can read, so please read them. The first principle is the inevitable expansion proposition, and I actually will read this slide. So the expansion of cities that population growth entails cannot be contained. Instead, we must make adequate room to accommodate it. So there are actually 2 philosophies on this idea, that we can't control the growth in cities. The dominant philosophy, and the philosophy that we hope to challenge, is called the containment paradigm. This holds that the growth in cities should be controlled and restricted, and urban expansion should be kept to a minimum. And this idea has been tried before. And if we look at history, we see that history is actually not very kind to this idea. For example, in the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth declared an end to urban growth outside the gates of the City of London. Since that stoppage was declared, the City of London has expanded an area over 1,000 times. It is 1,000 times bigger than it was when the Queen of England first started trying to control urban growth, despite the royal edict. In general, the only way to control urban expansion in any significant manner is through draconian measures and internal migration controls like the hukou system as it existed in China in the 1980s, which tied residential mobility to food supplies. So unless you lived in the town where you were supposed to live, you couldn't get a ration card. In an extreme case, Cambodia's Khmer Rouge regime emptied the city of Phnom Penh in a matter of months, causing millions of deaths and extreme hardship, because they had a philosophical belief that it was better if humans lived in rural areas. A more realistic and humane strategy is one that acknowledges the right of every citizen to freely migrate within the borders of his or her country. This is the making room paradigm. And perhaps the best example of this comes from my own city, New York. So in 1811, 3 commissioners and a surveyor plotted out a grid of streets stretching from the bottom tip of Manhattan all the way to the very top of the island. This grid, which is now called the Commissioner's Plan, expanded the area of the city 7-fold. Now at the time, Manhattan was actually a small city. It was located across about 4 square miles down at the tip of Manhattan Island. So the idea that Manhattan would eventually reach all the way to the top of this island, 12 miles to the top of this island, it was extremely audacious. At the time, people estimated that it would take 500 years before the city reached this extent. In fact, this was fully built up by 1890. And in a rare act of vision, the city expanded the grid yet again in 1900, adding extensive areas on the mainland, similar to Navi Mumbai today, and again increasing the size of the city by 8-fold. This 8-fold area was completely built up by 1930. This is not to say, and this is an important point, this is not to say that all cities will become New York, but there's a point here. When cities are planning for their urban expansion, it's always better to err on the side of too much growth. Most cities don't become very large, but in the minority of cities that do become very large, it's extremely important to have an orderly system in place for managing this expansion. Which brings us to the second principle, the sustainable densities proposition. City densities must be within a sustainable range. If they're too high, they have to be allowed to fall. If they're too low, they must be allowed to rise. So to put this point in some context, and by the way, so we have a slum area in Dhaka, Bangladesh as one extreme here, one of the most dense communities on earth. And in the other extreme, we have New Jersey, where they have laws prohibiting building housing on a smaller lot than this size. So artificial restrictions on increasing the density. So to put this point in context, much of the conversation in urban planning circles in the developed world revolves around density. And the question that people grapple with is, how do we increase density? So urban planners who live in New York go to New Jersey and they see this and they think, my gosh, we have to increase density. There's a neglected side to this conversation. In many places, Mumbai included, the issue is not how do we increase density. The issue is how do we lower density? How do we allow the city to decongest? In addition, it's important to remember when we think about density, density is actually not a design issue. So you can't really plan for density. Density is a market outcome. So to elaborate on that, in essence, density is the ratio of built-up area to people. So to put this another way, you might think of density as indicating to you how much space an individual person has access to. And another way of considering this is to think, how much space can an individual afford to consume? So there are many factors that affect how much space an individual can afford to consume, but the 2 biggest factors are the availability of space and the income of the individual. If space becomes more available and cheaper, a person will consume more of it. The same thing happens if incomes rise. Now, here's the critical point. Neither of these things are really under the control of planners. What planners can control are the rules and regulations that keep densities artificially low in the case of New Jersey, or artificially high in the case of Mumbai or Dhaka. Which indicates the next proposition here, the decent housing proposition. So the major factor in the price of housing is the cost of land. It stands to reason then that if land is affordable, housing will also be affordable. So we see here the example of a neighborhood in Bangkok, which has an essentially unregulated housing market. In this place, a house with land can be bought for around $6,000. And if you don't have $6,000 in cash, they'll let you make 120 payments. As a result, it's comparatively easy. In fact, around 1/3 of families living in slums are able to afford to move out of slums and move into stable housing like this. The lesson is simple. Land is affordable, so housing is affordable. However, an unregulated housing market will definitely produce affordable housing, but it will not automatically produce the most equitable or reasonable city. Bangkok lacks a sewer system, for example. This diagram here shows a typical 8 kilometer by 8 kilometer area of Bangkok. So it lacks a sewer system, and it also lacks a network of public open spaces and major roads. The density of arterial roads in Bangkok is about 1 road per every 8 kilometers, with the result that traffic is atrocious. In Toronto, Canada, by contrast, arterial roads are laid out on a 1 mile by 1 mile grid. This is facilitating public transportation. And to indicate that point, this map here in the upper right-hand corner is not a map of the arterial road grid of Toronto, Canada. This is a map of the bus and streetcar lines in Toronto, Canada. So you can see how having this grid in place facilitates these bus and streetcar lines.